Hello, and welcome to the first video in this two-part series about interviewing for the academic job market. I'm Dr. Claire Forsty, a staff member at the Center for Educational Innovation, the University of Minnesota's System-Wide Teaching Center. I earned my PhD in sociology back in 2017, and I've been a tenure-track faculty member and also a member of academic search committees throughout my 20-ish year career in higher education. Our focus in this series is mainly on the academic job search in the US, so you'll want to be aware that cultural norms vary at institutions beyond the US and even across different types of institutions. In this video, I'll talk about what exactly an academic interview is, and I'll share some strategies to prepare. So, first of all, what exactly is the academic interview? Who are we interviewing with in an academic interview? And the reality is, academic interviews could be composed of a bunch of different components. We'll have one particular focus on the interview with the search committee in the series for today, but other folks you will interview with in an academic interview could include the department chair, maybe a dean of the unit you'd be working in, sometimes the provost, depending on the type of institution and the provost's interest in hiring faculty. You may also be interviewing with undergraduate or graduate students, depending on what work you'd be doing. Staff, academic staff are typically part of the process. They may not be interviewing you, but they certainly are involved. And there may be some other folks who are part of the academic interview process as well. So, one example from my own experience is in one academic interview I participated in, I interviewed with union representatives because the faculty at that institution were unionized. And there may be other folks too. So, be aware that academic interview can actually mean lots of different types of interview. And if you watch the video about campus visits, you'll get a little bit more information about what that looks like. Now, what I want you to do before we move forward is just to take a minute and engage in an exercise of imagining. So, imagine for a minute what your dream academic institution would be. What kind of institution is it? So, take a few minutes and pause this slide and reflect on these questions. So, in your notes, describe it a little bit. Think about what kind of institution it is, what your department is like, what kinds of students you'd be working with in your ideal situation. So, some ways to think about this could be what are the teaching, research, and service expectations? For teaching focused institutions, typically you're spending 50 to 75% of your time focused on teaching. For research intensive institutions, teaching might only be about 25%, research much more. What about service? So, what's your ideal there? Where is your dream institution located? What region in the country? Maybe what state? What city? Are you interested in urban or rural contexts? What resources exist to support you and your students? Is there grant funding? Are there course releases available? Is there funding available for your students as well to engage in service work or participate in internships? How does the institution align with their values? Do they have a particular interest in supporting first generation students, for example? Think about who your students are going to be. Think about where the institution is putting its resources, and then other factors that come up for you for this dream institution. So take a few minutes before you move on and just brainstorm a little bit about where you'd like to be. Now, assuming that you've thought a little bit about your ideal institution, let's imagine that congratulations, you got an email inviting you for a first round interview. One way to think about this is that your interview kind of starts with this email. So you want to be sure to respond promptly to the email. Certainly doesn't need to be the minute it comes in, but within a few hours is great. Within 24 hours is ideal. You want to be polite and clear in your response. You can also be enthusiastic about it. You can share that you're excited to be invited for the first round interview. And you also want to be honest with them about your needs. So if you have an accommodation request, you want to state that clearly and upfront and keep things brief and straightforward. And lastly, don't forget to celebrate. I think we don't take enough opportunities to celebrate the successes. And even if it feels a little premature, you've gotten to this point. So take a little bit of time to celebrate that you've moved forward and gotten to this step. Okay, now it's time to do some research. So, some questions that you might ask yourself to prepare for your first round interview might be: what kind of institution is this? What's their mission? Do they have a teaching focus or a research focus? What kinds of students do they serve? What is the department like? How many faculty are in the department? How many adjunct faculty are in the department? What types of courses do they offer typically? What are they offering right now, if you can find that out? So you want to do a little bit of research to start out, but no need to spend days and days doing research. Maybe just overall a couple few hours just to get a feel for the kind of institution and be able to talk about it. Speaking of types of institutions, I just want to take a little side note here. I find this fact is sometimes not really effectively conveyed to graduate students. And so I want you to think for just a second. You could think about this as a quick quiz. In the US, what percent of 4 year colleges and universities are research focused, what we would call R1s and R2s in the Carnegie classification, versus more teaching focused? So, what percent of 4 year colleges and universities are research focused versus teaching focused? So, let me just be quiet for a few seconds while you think about that question. All right, it's time for the answer. So it's actually less than 10%. So I think that's an important number to know when you're considering what types of institutions to apply to. The vast majority of 4 year higher ed institutions in the US are focused in some way on teaching. So bear that in mind when you're thinking about where to apply, what kinds of application materials you might need to prepare. This also, by the way, is not including community colleges, 2 year institutions, which are very teaching focused and don't often have as much research activity as other kinds of 4 year institutions. So be aware of the range of institutions. And if you're not really sure what's available, you can talk to your colleagues about that. You can find folks across the institution who can share a little bit more information about that. Okay, so now that you've thought about the type of institution this is, what you want to do is go back to the job listing really carefully, read it through, and break it out into some questions you might think you'll be asked. I'll share some sample questions in a little bit, but if the job listing includes things like types of courses they expect you to teach, you'll want to make note of any specifics in the job listing that they might ask you about in that interview. Sometimes you'll be asked about those specifics in a second round interview, but best to be prepared up front. And then you want to write your draft questions and some preliminary answers down. You could think about one thing I did when I was on the job market was setting up a template where I had some standard questions I would prepare for every single type of institution. And then after reading the job ad, I would add a few more questions specific to that institution with a few ideas for answers. They don't need to be fully fleshed out or complete sentences because you'll be talking about them in an interview, but you want to have some ideas in your head. So it's best to write down some notes before you head into the interview. Now, I know that we all have been interacting with each other virtually for a while now, but I wanted to take a second just to share some reminders about first round interviews on Zoom or through some other virtual mechanism. Some institutions use Microsoft Teams or other kinds of tools. So there are a few things, just a few reminders to keep in mind. First, things like your presentation, how you present yourself, do matter. So, having appropriate lighting so your interviewers can see your face, having a camera angle that's pointed directly into your face instead of upward or down, your background, having some kind of neutral background, those things do matter. They're not complete deal breakers, but it communicates something about your professionalism. So you'll want to do your best to test your lighting, test your camera angle and your background to make sure you look okay for an interview. And again, I put the word professional in scare quotes here because I think it's good to be a little bit skeptical of what we convey as professional, reinforces some norms that we might not find useful or might not align with our values. So, anyway, professional presentation does matter. So, what you wear, your sense of confidence. I know that folks say sometimes to be comfortable, but there is some good advice to wear a professional interview outfit, whatever that means for you, so you can project a sense of confidence. That's really the key point there. How can you be confident in your interview? Make sure that you're prepared to take some notes about what folks are sharing with you, any clues that you get for the next round of interview. So, if you are not taking notes right now in this video series, it's a great time to practice. Be sure that you practice with colleagues too. You can have your set of interview questions ready to go. You can practice through Zoom with some colleagues or some friends or close family. And this last point, within sociology, we have this concept called front stage. And what front stage means is how you professionally present yourself to the world. There's also our backstage, which is where we're a little more informal. And what I mean by this last point, this be a front stage human, is it's okay to convey your humanity, maybe a little bit of who you are, a sense of humor, if you have one. Be a front stage human, be a professional human, but you can be a little bit human too. And that can help you connect with your potential future colleagues. And remember that your interviewers are humans too. So they are really trying to project a positive image of their institution. Pay attention to that. Pay attention to the clues, even in the first round interview, about how they talk about their institution, how engaged they are in the interview, and remember that they're human beings with complex lives, just like we are. Sometimes that can help a little bit in making connections in an interview. So, in case your first round interview is an in person interview, here are a few additional things to consider. So, first, every time I look at the news, I feel like I hear about a new wave of COVID making the rounds. So, it's okay. In fact, you should ask about COVID protocols if it seems appropriate and make sure that you are protecting yourself. You want to arrive early, but not too early. So, one of the awkward things that can happen is departments can schedule interviews back to back. So, you don't want to get there so early that you run into another candidate. That can be a little awkward. So, arriving early means maybe 5 to 10 minutes early. So, plan your travel accordingly. You want to have paper copies of your materials on hand, like your CV, like your application letter, any other materials that you submitted, just in case. You never know. And also, obviously, have a notepad if you're taking notes, hopefully. So, have something to take notes in. This may sound like an obvious point. Make eye contact with everyone in the room. But I will tell you, there's some research that shows that in interviews, sometimes candidates only look at people they perceive as men and don't make eye contact with women in the room. So just make sure that you are making eye contact with everyone in the room. It's something that we notice and it can convey something about what kind of person you are to work with. It's one of those little things that people do, maybe unintentionally, but it happens. So make sure that you are making eye contact with everyone and use your professor voice. We'll get into what that means in a little bit, what it means to practice being a professor even while you're a grad student, which you should be doing. So use your professor voice. We'll talk more about that in a bit. So, what kinds of questions are you likely to be asked in your first round interview? Some questions might include things like, why are you interested in this institution specifically? Why are you interested in this position? Why are you in your discipline? What caused you to become so interested in your discipline generally? You may be asked to talk about your research. And sometimes an unstated or implicit piece of that question is you're being asked to connect your research to their institution and to their students specifically. So it can't hurt to sprinkle in a little bit of that knowledge that you learned about the institution as you talk about your research. For example, this would be a great project to engage students in. I have an idea for how to do that. So that's a good way to connect your research to that institution. You might be asked how you'd approach teaching specific courses, specifically the courses noted in the job posting. So that's where your research will come in. And then you might be asked about how you value diversity and inclusion, and in particular, how you can demonstrate really concretely your commitment to working with the students at that specific institution. So, concrete, clear evidence answers to those questions are really important. And there might be other questions you could be asked too. A best practice for interviews is for interviewers to share your questions in advance. That's not super common yet in higher education, but it's possible. And if you get the questions in advance, great. Make sure that you prepare using those. Now, what kinds of questions are you going to ask when you get to the end of that short, maybe half-hour first round interview? There's usually some time for you to ask questions, and what you do in that time really is important. So, a couple of things to think about there. Remember, you are also interviewing them. You want to get a sense from them about whether this is a place you really want to work or can work and how long you want to work there, right? So keep your questions brief and you can keep them general, but it's great to show a little bit of knowledge about the institution. So, a couple of questions you can ask is recognizing the students at that institution. How do they support student success? What does that look like? What does that look like financially in terms of programming? You can ask about experiences working with students as well. And you can also ask them about how they support your success as a faculty member. What programs are in place? What funding is in place to ensure that you're going to be successful on the tenure track? And the questions that you ask could vary by the type of institution. Now, what does an effective response to interview questions sound like? So, when you respond to questions, I have kind of three general tips. What you want to do is you want to be specific. You want to be what I think of as kind of casually brief, and you want to be positively responsive. So, what I mean by that is you want to be specific. So, try to thread through examples, specific examples. This is not the time to be overly philosophical without some evidence to back it up. So, be specific in examples of what you've done or what you could do in response to the questions. You want to be brief, but you want to be kind of casually brief. And what I mean by that is first, you don't want to ramble. If you are at all inclined to ramble like me, you want to practice being brief in your responses. And you don't want to be overly formal. So some might be inclined to memorize a response to questions and recite them from memory. Don't do that. That will sound awkward, I think, to interviewers. So think about how you can get comfortable enough with your answers so you can respond in a human way, right? Not just memorizing responses to answers. And third, be responsive to the actual question. So don't try to pivot away from the question that you're being asked. And you want to be aware of not ever saying that you don't do something. So that's the positive piece. So think about what you can share about what you've done or what you can do when you respond to a question. I know sometimes as graduate students, we're trained to say, well, I don't do this or I don't do that. In an interview, what you want to say is, well, that connects to work I do in this particular way, or this is something I'd like to experiment with in my teaching. So try to frame your experience and how you're thinking about the question positively rather than conveying a deficit. If you want the opportunity to practice an interview, these are a couple of questions you could practice with. So you could find a buddy, find a colleague, maybe watch this video with a colleague, and take a little bit of time. Think about the kind of dream institution where you want to interview, and take a minute to respond to one of these two questions. Number one, what's a course you'd be prepared to teach for our department right now? Number two, describe your current research. Will you be continuing in this research track? And tell us a little bit about your future research plans. So you could practice with one or both of these questions working with a buddy. If you've practiced your interview, maybe do a little self assessment. So, in your notes, reflect a little bit about how it went. First, were you positively responsive to the question? Were you specific and brief in your response? Did your answer show your knowledge about the kind of institution where you'd like to work? For example, kinds of students you'd be working with, availability of research resources, or maybe not, the department focus and needs. In other words, were you able to thread a little bit of knowledge about the institution into your responses? And then, were you able to project yourself as a future colleague? Search committee members are wondering, how is this person going to be as a colleague? Are they going to be easy to work with? Are things going to be fun even? How are they going to be? So, did you speak with a bit of authority, but not arrogance? It's a tricky balance. And responding to these questions can be challenging, especially right off the top of your head. And that's why preparation can be really helpful. I know I've been going on and on about taking notes. Okay, I think we get it. And what does that mean? What does that look like in an academic interview? So make sure you're taking some notes about who's on the search committee. If you're like me, maybe you have a terrible memory for names. I have a really hard time with that. So I always write down the names of the people on the search committee as they introduce themselves. Take some notes about the kinds of questions they asked, also about your answers to those questions if you can. Take some notes about any clues about the next round of interviews, things they might be looking for. And then anything they share with you in terms of search administration. So, what the timeline is, what the next steps are, when you can expect to hear. And I think it's always nice, even for a first round interview, to send kind of a nice follow up generic thank you email to the search committee members, which is why it's really important to write down their names so you can Google them later and find their email addresses. So, a short little thanks so much for talking with me. I really enjoyed hearing from you about XYZ or learning more about your institution. A quick little follow up thank you email can't hurt. I have this image of Carmen Sandiego in this slide just as a reminder that we all need to be prepared to be a little bit of a detective when we're doing our work on the job market. So, thinking forward to your second round or third round of interviews with the search committee, some things you want to do are follow those clues that you took notes about from the first interview. Be prepared to describe some courses and your research in a little more detail. You want to do some poking around about tenure requirements. Sometimes that information is publicly available, and it can be helpful to see what those requirements actually are. And you can be prepared to speak to them in a next round interview. So, for example, it looks like my expectation is that I'll spend 50% of my time focused on teaching, and this is how I'll plan to stay focused on that. Think about what the different requirements are and how you plan to meet them. Try to be aware of what courses are being taught right now. Just because courses are listed on departmental websites doesn't mean they're being taught in the moment. So you want to find the course search function for that institution and see what courses are being taught maybe this semester, couple previous semesters, as much in the future as you can. There is a link in the slides that are part of the resources for this series with some typical questions that you could practice responding to for the second and third round of interviews. Again, use some internet sleuthing skills. Poke around a bit. See if you can find out more about the search committee members, about the department itself. So use the skills that you have. And then find out if anyone in your networks is connected to that institution in any way. Maybe they're an alum, maybe they have worked there. So now's the time to check in with those folks about what their experiences were at that institution. Before we wrap up this video, I have two suggestions for you. So, in your notes, you might identify two people from your discipline that you want to contact to ask about their interview experiences. Maybe you've done this already, maybe you can find another one or two. These people can be alums of your current program, they could be new faculty in your department, they could be colleagues that you met at a conference. I would advise you not to talk with other grad students who are on the job market right now. That can feel a little bit awkward and folks may not want to share what's going on with them, but find folks who've recently been on the job market and ask them about how it went, what their takeaways were, what they did to prepare and whether it helped. So you also can brainstorm a bit about the kinds of questions that you're going to ask them about their experiences. So make sure you have a few prepared in advance. You want to be mindful of their time always when you're doing informational interviews like that. Now, in the next video, we're going to talk a little bit more about how you communicate something called fit with an institution and also how you can start practice being a professor right now.
Hello, and thank you from the Center for Educational Innovation for viewing part one of this presentation on academic interviewing. As a reminder, the Google folder we've collected can be found at z.umn.edu/academic interviewing resources gs. Again, thank you and carry on to part two.